If you've been alive any time in the last centuries, you haven't been able to avoid the concept of diet programs. Since 1864, when an early fad diet sang the praises of the low-carb lifestyle, we've been inundated with diet books, ads, and storefronts. A lot of these diets come and go, but some of them have real sticking power, especially when they're reflective of established nutritional patterns. One diet you've probably heard of is the Mediterranean diet, and one of the reasons you may have heard of it is that it actually works, like weirdly well. And in some ways, it doesn't seem like it should work. So what does the research say about this pattern of food intake, and how do we even go about researching this at all? Diet advice should be taken with a grain of salt, but maybe this one should be taken with a dash of olive oil. Real quick, this video is about diet stuff, including things like calorie restriction. If that's not a cool topic for you, we don't mind if you want to skip this one. Officially speaking, the Mediterranean diet describes the typical pattern of eating in Crete and southern Greece around 1960. Similar diets come from other areas of the Mediterranean basin, including southern Europe, northern Africa, and western Asia. In other words, areas that grow a lot of olives. Those olives are critical, not because of martinis, but because one of the notable features of the Mediterranean diet is that olive oil is the primary source of fat, and it is not used sparingly. In fact, up to 40% of the calories for people who eat this way come from fat. For a long time, the prevailing wisdom was that that much fat was not a good thing, but as we'll see, this diet proves otherwise. The diet also includes a lot of fruit, vegetables, nuts, breads, and other plants, low or moderate amounts of fish, poultry, dairy, and red wine, and low amounts of red meat and processed sugars. So to be clear, the Mediterranean diet is not a fad diet, it's just the diet of Mediterraneans. While yes, there are tons of contemporary cookbooks with attractive influencer types on the cover, this dietary pattern has actually been officially recognized by UNESCO as a cultural heritage connected to its geographical origin. The first epidemiological study of the diet began in 1958, collecting decades of research on middle-aged male residents of 7 countries. In the years since, it's become one of the most well-studied dietary patterns in the world, but it's tough to study the impacts of a diet. In an ideal world, we'd do a randomized controlled trial where large numbers of participants are sorted into groups. One group follows the Mediterranean diet for decades, and one group eats other stuff. But that's not really possible with something as comprehensive as a dietary pattern. Getting tens of thousands of people to change their entire diets for decades for a scientific study is a huge ask. But randomized controlled trials are the gold standard in health research, and it's not like you can't do them at all. Where it makes sense is on shorter timeframes to study what are called surrogate markers. These are intermediate health outcomes that relate to a specific diagnosis or endpoint, which you can use to approximate how that endpoint is going. So for example, you can use blood pressure or cholesterol as a surrogate marker for coronary heart disease, or serum estradiol for postmenopausal breast cancer. And it's a lot easier to keep track of what somebody eats for a year and see how that affects their LDL cholesterol than to ask them to change their diet for decades to see whether they eventually develop coronary heart disease. Researchers complement these shorter randomized controlled trials with prospective cohort studies. In this type of study, researchers follow groups of people before any of the outcomes they're studying occur. So if you wanted to study whether the Mediterranean diet affects the development of heart disease, you wouldn't select participants who already had heart disease to see how following the Mediterranean diet affected it. You'd select participants, track what they eat over long periods of time, and follow who gets heart disease at what point. Mediterranean diet studies typically aren't separated into simple, yes, this person follows the diet, no, this person doesn't. Instead, they use a score that assigns points to different aspects of the diet, like a D&D character sheet. Participants get a rating on 9 different components. For example, do they eat more fruits and nuts than most people? Do they eat more vegetables? Do they eat less meat? Do they drink moderate amounts of alcohol? In these types of prospective studies, that allows researchers to see when participants follow Mediterranean eating patterns more or less closely. If people are more likely to develop heart disease when they're eating less like the diet, that can suggest that the diet is related. By combining results from these 2 types of studies, researchers can make a stronger claim about causality. Basically, you have indirect evidence from the observational study that following the diet more closely over the long term reduces heart disease, and you have direct evidence from the interventional studies that the diet lowers LDL cholesterol. Put these together and scientists can make make a pretty compelling case that the Mediterranean diet lowers the risk of heart disease. And while the actual research methods are a little complicated, they tell us a lot. A 2021 comprehensive review looked at studies of the impact of the Mediterranean diet on 7 different health outcomes and rated the strength of the research on a 0 to 4 scale. 0 represented no evidence of link, and 4 represented convincing evidence of a link backed up by multiple lines of evidence of the type we've discussed. And none of the health outcomes they looked at scored below a 2, which means there was at least suggestive evidence of the Mediterranean diet having an impact on every single one. We'll get into the specifics in a moment, but first, all science needs funding, so here's a quick break.
Introducing the new Brilliant. Brilliant is an online learning platform that offers guided courses ranging from introduction to functions to algorithmic thinking. So anyone from 5th graders to post-grad can learn something new. And now, Brilliant is entering its personal tutor era. Private tutors are far better than one teacher for 30 students, but they're expensive and hard to fit into your schedule. And those are barriers Brilliant is trying to lower. They're working to bring a world-class math and coding tutor to every home with their new visual interactive tutor. Click the link below or scan the QR code to get started with Brilliant's tutor for free. You can upgrade to premium to unlock all courses. And right now, SciShow viewers can save 20% off an annual subscription at brilliant.org/scishow.
The strongest evidence category starts off with cardiovascular disease, where cohort studies show that higher Mediterranean diet scores are associated with lower risk of coronary heart disease, reduced risk of stroke, and fewer cases of and deaths from cardiovascular disease. The Mediterranean diet also lowered blood pressure, blood lipids like cholesterol, and markers of inflammation in intervention studies, giving it a big thumbs up for its ability to improve our heart health. Diabetes is also in this category, with cohort studies showing that people who follow a Mediterranean diet have a lower risk of type 2 diabetes, and intervention studies showing that type 2 diabetes patients that follow the diet have better glycemic control. Rounding out the convincing evidence is metabolic syndrome, which makes sense because metabolic syndrome relates to risk factors for both cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. In prospective studies, people who eat the Mediterranean way have lower risk of metabolic syndrome, and in intervention studies, it's more likely to go into remission when people follow the diet. That's a really strong start for the Mediterranean diet. In that same review of health impacts, the highly suggestive category reflects health outcomes with 3 or more observational studies reporting a relationship with the Mediterranean diet, with no studies that clearly refute them. Cognitive function fell into this category, with adherence to the Mediterranean diet being associated with lower risk of Alzheimer's disease and age-related cognitive decline. Cancer was also in this category. There's evidence of a relationship between the Mediterranean diet and lower risk of breast cancer, as well as lower overall rates of cancer incidence and cancer deaths. Our final category are the health outcomes where the evidence is suggestive that the Mediterranean diet can make a difference. By suggestive, the researchers mean there are 1 or 2 studies that support the link and no studies that clearly refute it. To start off, while overall cancer risk and death were in the highly suggestive category, most specific cancers fall here, specifically colorectal, head and neck, respiratory, gastric, liver, and bladder cancer. Overweight and obesity fall in this category too. It may seem counterintuitive because culturally speaking, we tend to associate the concept of diets with weight loss. We also tend to associate the idea of weight loss diets with low fat, and this is far from a low-fat diet. That's why some doctors don't recommend it as often for weight loss as they do for other health concerns. There is, however, compelling evidence that the Mediterranean diet doesn't cause weight gain or increases in waist circumference. And when it comes to losing weight and fat, there is some evidence that the Mediterranean diet is more effective than some other diets when people are restricting how many calories they're eating. So it's possible that eating 1,600 calories a day of a Mediterranean diet may result in greater weight and fat loss than eating 1,600 calories a day in just a general calorie reduction. A calorie unrestricted Mediterranean diet doesn't seem to do much for obesity, so researchers are thinking that reducing calories is still more important than the specific nutrients you get on the Med diet. And finally, there's total mortality. Cohort studies do indicate that eating a Mediterranean diet is associated with a reduction in total overall mortality. The evidence here is merely suggestive though, because it's really hard to do long-term intervention studies where the outcome you're measuring is, death. But it makes sense, given that the Mediterranean diet is associated with a lower risk of death from all of the specific causes we just listed out. But it's not just that. The diet is also associated with longer telomeres. Telomeres are sections at the end of chromosomes that are known to be shorter in connection with cell damage through stress and inflammation. They are typically what people talk about when they say cellular aging. Longer telomeres indicate slower age-related biological processes, which could result in lower mortality. But researchers are still trying to figure out exactly why the Mediterranean diet has such broad health effects. One approach is to look at the different parts of the diet as individual pieces. For example, the high intake of fruit and veggies may be what impacts cognitive functioning, and the inclusion of nuts may be the reason for better heart health. If that's the case, then the reason that the Mediterranean diet has so many health effects will be that there are so many different healthy parts of it. But there does seem to be more to it than just that. Researchers are now studying the way that the different parts of the diet and different nutrients interact with each other. One hypothesis is related to inflammation and oxidative stress, which can cause cell damage. The cell damage can lead to cardiovascular disease, cancer, dementia, and diabetes, just to name a few. And there's evidence that the Mediterranean diet improves several different indicators of inflammation and oxidative stress. Now, we still don't know the specific pathway by which the Med diet might calm down inflammation. It may be that the nutrients involved tamp down on things that cause inflammation, ramp up things that prevent inflammation, make cells more resistant to inflammation, or change the way the immune system communicates. Whatever the mechanism, though, it seems that the Mediterranean diet has some really important system-wide effects on our health. Even better, the Mediterranean diet isn't just good for people, it's good for the environment too. Because it's mainly plant-based, it uses less water and has lower greenhouse gas emissions than many other dietary patterns. And at least in traditional settings, the meat that's consumed comes from animals that graze among tree crops that already exist, as opposed to growing grains specifically for animal feed, which also lowers the environmental impact. But we are not doctors, and we can't recommend you switch to the Mediterranean diet for your health. What we can say, though, is that multiple members of the SciShow team have had our doctors recommend this diet to us, so take that for what it's worth. But I, for one, have never turned down an excuse to eat more hummus. And if that happens to make me healthier, that sounds like a win-win.